First, I'd like to join my colleagues in welcoming our newest members to the Executive Board, both provincial and perimeter. We look forward to your participation and your expertise. There's a lot of information to impart to you today, which includes our regular financial updates to the progress of the SAFER Committee, so let's get to it. A reminder first, we are quickly approaching January 1st, 2020, and the day of ALPA's dues rate drops from 1.9% to 1.85%, which, give me a minute. All right. So based on 2019 dues income, that would have been amounted to about a 2.6% drop in funding to all accounts. However, with a full year impact by the contracted Frontier and dues income with WestJet and WestJet Encore, to name a few, the actual difference between 2019 and 2020 dues income is an increase of about 2.8%. At last year's Executive Board and BOD, we raised the minimum qualification for the OCF operating fund. It's in the lower right-hand corner of this slide. And for those MECs will receive monthly allocations to provide them with the same level of funding as if under the 1.90% rate. So during the early stages of budgeting, the budgeting process, we have to estimate what we believe the dues income to be. This slide shows the difference between the dues income using three different scenarios. The baseline forecast is purposely conservative. For example, we usually cut the market expectations for growth in half and don't bank on gains not yet realized. The baseline plus forecast, in contrast, assumes full growth expectations, and the baseline minus scenario assumes growth as if in the baseline scenario, but with no additional profit sharing beyond what has already been earned in the first half of the current year. These three scenarios help develop a prudent dues forecast with the confidence that it will hold up under different problematic economic outcomes. This slide, as a reminder, is how the dues dollars are allocated within the association. Note that the percentages after a series of off-the-top amounts such as Canada Board, OCF, MCF, and the magazine income allocations. A more in-depth discussion of the 2020 budget will take place in Delegate Committee 1. Another byproduct of the 2020 dues reduction was the Structure, Services, and Finance Review Committee, or SAFER. This committee was created by the Executive Board last year and tasked with reviewing these four topics: MCF and OCF levels, funding of national committees, allocations of the MECs, LECs, ANS, and OCF accounts, and procurement policies. The committee goals in more general terms were to look at how to better spend our pilots' money, how to get more people involved in volunteering in order to build our bench, and to bring some of the spending limits and restrictions into the 21st century and allow for more straightforward and beneficial spending rules in our MEC and LEC budget accounts. Since the initial assignment, the Executive Council has added several additional topics to the committee's agenda. The committee has met several times and a number of recommendations for the Executive Board to consider this week. Our next meeting is planned for November 20th through the 22nd. Some of the recommendations affect how items were funded in the budget, and these recommendations have been adopted by the Executive Council for the 2020 budget. First up is addressing the issue of MECs paying for their members' work and travel time when participating in national committees. Currently, the flight pay loss of only the chairman, and in some cases the vice chairman, are funded by most national committee budgets. And the MEC might be put in a position of not being able to provide the funds for a pilot volunteer to do national committee work. I believe that the ability to participate on a committee should be based solely on the expertise they bring and not whether their MEC can afford to send them. The SAFER recommendation was that the 2020 budget set aside more money for national committees with the goal of funding flight pay loss to attend at least one meeting for each member of our committees, along with the committee's core activities such as visits to schools for the Education Committee, an additional day of flight pay loss for each member for flexibility. While this is a small step towards more participation, the budgeting committee decided to take a slow and steady approach. Similarly, we've heard from MECs and LECs that they're unable to send pilots to important volunteer training due to lack of funds or because repeated turnover has required more training needs than anticipated. As such, SAFER has recommended a budget line item of $100,000 to be solely used to provide funds to an MEC to send a pilot for necessary events sponsored by ALPA. Drawing from this fund requires approval from the VP of Finance and provides another avenue to make sure volunteers are properly trained in their positions. During this meeting, the Executive Board will be asked to consider several changes to the administrative manual. First of these resolutions addresses how the MEC defines the amount of full-time flight pay loss a pilot can accrue, as well as the value of a day. As you see here, currently Section 60 is somewhat vague and not specific. The recommendation is that each MEC that does not already have language adopt into their policy manual the definitions of full-time flight pay loss and the value of a day. Once that is complete and a copy is provided to the VP of Finance and to the Finance Department, flight pay loss costs charged to a national committee or other administrative and support budgets will be funded and administered in a manner that reflects the respective pilot's MEC. More detail on this subject will be discussed in Delegate Committee 1 as well. We've also heard feedback from our pilot leaders that the list of allowable expenditures for LECs is much too restrictive, which limits the LEC's ability to spend their money. In recent years, very few LECs have incurred deficits. Our policies should allow LECs to spend their income allocations on reasonable business expenses, so SAFER recommends adding 4 additional authorized expense categories for LECs to Section 60, as you see here. It's still somewhat restrictive, but adding the additional authorized expense categories will allow LEC budgets to be charged for business costs that have been limited to MEC budgets in the past. These next 2 items are an attempt, as I said earlier, to bring us into the 21st century. Currently, any taxi ride that costs above $12 requires a receipt for reimbursement, and that's been the same amount for about 20 years. To bring us up to date, SAFER recommends increasing that floor to $25. Not only that, but SAFER also recommends adding buses, trains, and subways to this policy, meaning any taxi, bus, or train ride under $25 would no longer require a receipt. And just like prices have gone up, so has the expected tips for services. No longer is the 15% an acceptable tip in most places for ground transportation drivers. So SAFER recommends updating our policy to allow for a 20% tip. The committee concluded that ALPA is incurring too much risk with rental cars and not allowing the reimbursement of rental car insurance. Rising repair costs and potential damages related to rental car usage led SAFER to recommend the current policy be reversed, and that ALPA now require the purchase and reimbursement of rental car insurance while on ALPA business. Similarly, our procurement limits are over 20 years old and in many cases require updating. So we recommended increasing authorization limits for MEC, LEC, and committee chairs, increasing the threshold for when you need competitive bids, and increasing purchase amounts that require capitalization. Finally, SAFER reviewed the case where employer retirement contributions that fall above IRS limits this year, that's earnings over $280,000, and max contributions of $56,000, be considered as wages and in most cases considered duesable. Some MECs have additional qualified plans to deposit this spillover and therefore not considered as income. However, for those that don't, an argument has been made that since funds were initially allocated for retirement, they should not be subject to dues. ALPA decided to cease collecting dues on these monies until the governing bodies can consider the issue. SAFER then concluded that while the current policy states that these amounts should be subject to dues, the committee supports the suspension of dues to allow the matter to be discussed by the 2020 Board of Directors. You'll have a chance to consider each of these committee recommendations in the coming days, and we welcome any feedback. The committee believes that these proposals will support prudent expenditures by your union along with necessary oversight that we are eager to hear from you and your thoughts regarding any of these recommendations. Now let's take a look at the bottom line. Audited results for 2018 show an operational surplus on a consolidated basis of more than $36.5 million, which is still sizable, but it's also $12.5 million of a decrease from 2017. Both 2017 and 2018 surpluses can be attributed to increased profit-sharing payments and new contracts that have made major improvements since the bankruptcy era over a decade ago. For 2018, ALPA dues revenue was $202 million, and looking at ALPA expenses for the year, salaries and benefits totaled $72 million, flight pay loss incurred was $43 million, and the remainder was total $53 million, which includes $2.4 million dispersed by the PAC. Here, you see our consolidated operating income for the year and over the past decade. Our final 2018 numbers came in lower than the prior 2 years due to increased expenses, increased retirements, and some flattening in airline growth. As you see here, we are continuing to increase our budgeted and actual dues income. Yeah, there we go. This has been moving in a positive direction since 2009, as the chart shows. We expect similar movements this year as well. You'll note as well the gap between the projected dues and the actual dues, which demonstrates the conservative budgeting practices that has allowed us to recapitalize our finances and has contributed to our current solid financial footing. I'm happy to report that last month's ALPA's Executive Council unanimously approved next year's budget. For 2020, we plan at $210 million in dues revenue, with an increase, again, from 2019, even with the dues reduction. And here we see the breakdown of the budgeted dues, the amount taken off the top before allocations, and our expected expenditures. As you see, the Executive Council recently voted to transfer $12.1 million from the Strategic Reserve to the Major Contingency Fund. More on that later. The Administrative and Support Account, or A&S account, funds ALPA's national committees, departments, and operations. Expenses cover employee salaries, property rental and maintenance, governing bodies and national committee flight pay loss costs, and meeting expenses. As you know, the A&S account is ALPA's largest account. The $105.6 million budget for 2020 represents a modest 9.9% increase over last year and includes the hiring of 8 new positions, mostly in representation, engineering, and air safety departments. Without those new 8 positions, in fact, employee costs are flat. This slide highlights the consolidated financial performance of ALPA through August 31st, 2019. $176 million of income with $108 million in expenses has generated a year-to-date surplus of $67.8 million. This slide provides a more detailed breakdown of the various sources of this year's income as they compare to the association's largest expense categories. As mentioned earlier, ALPA continues to operate with a surplus. Looking now just at the A&S budgets, this year, just like last year, we're expecting increased revenue as compared to the budget estimates for A&S income. But we're also witnessing a decrease in actual expenses compared to budget estimates. Thanks to that combination, we've almost tripled our anticipated surplus, demonstrating continued prudent use of our pilots' hard-earned dues dollars in representing their needs. ALPA's Operating Contingency Fund, or OCF, is a sinking fund with surpluses that are carried forward year after year. The OCF also receives 3.5% of dues income through the ALPA's annual spending limit policy allocations. Thanks to your continued focus on financial discipline, the OCF fund balance continues to move in a positive direction. There has been steady growth and stabilization in the fund over the past decade. In fact, this growth allowed us to transfer $7 million to help further recapitalize the MCF 2 years ago while still trending upward, as you can see here. The OCF is divided into 3 sub-funds: the operating fund, the contingency fund, which is the largest one by far, and the special projects fund. As I alluded to a moment ago, both the operating fund and the contingency fund offer the MECs a source of supplemental financing when pilot groups are engaged in contract negotiations or facing extraordinary circumstances. The current balance of $27.1 million as of August 31st will ensure that MECs have supplemental funds available to them to meet their pilot groups' goals and objectives. In fact, 6 pilot groups have been granted operating fund allocations nearing $1.5 million this year, with $700,000 used thus far. The major contingency fund continues to be the association's most visible strategic asset, and the board of directors has endorsed initiatives to protect and enhance the fund. Since its inception in 1985, the MCF has dispersed $143.5 million to pilot groups in advanced stages of negotiations, including cooling off periods. Other uses of the fund have included debt reduction, funding of Kitty Hawk, reimbursement of certain legal expenses, some organizing, and unbudgeted advocacy needs. Through use and declining investments during the financial crisis, the fund hit a year-end low of $42.9 million in 2015. That year, the MCF Review Board recommended that ALPA make recapitalization of the MCF a priority. As you can see from the chart, our efforts are taking hold, with an upward trend from 2015 on. There's still a lot of work to be done, but we're well on our way. As I mentioned earlier, in the 2020 budget, we have an allocation from our strategic reserve of $12.1 million that will go to the MCF. Currently, the MCF balance stands at $82.4 million. That's close to $40 million more than the year-end low just 5 years ago, and we're headed to levels over the pre-global financial crisis balance of $85 million. With this growth, one of the current and future topics of the SAFER Committee is to discuss potential new uses for the fund. This discussion has 2 elements. First, whether or not to increase the scope of the fund, and if so, how. And then only then can we discuss the limitations for the fund balance. You'll hear more about this from SAFER in the future. For the first 8 months of 2019, MCF expenses has totaled $206,000, with 2 pilot groups receiving allocations. You notice there's a $1 million allocation for Keep Flying Safe that was approved by the executive board last year. That allocation helps fund their continuous effort against those who want to pursue single pilot operations. In 2018, we were successful in keeping it out of the FAA reauthorization bill, and we believe that much of that had to do with the hard-hitting advocacy campaign. You've all seen the announcements about our upcoming improvements in our ALPA-sponsored insurance plans. We periodically review, typically every 5 years, our vendors, their performance, and the marketplace to ensure our plans remain best in class and competitively priced. ALPA has changed from New York Life to Guardian Life Insurance as the insurance providers of life insurance in 2012. Since that time, because of premium rate guarantees in place, the Guardian contract was not completed for 7 years. However, in 2018, a comprehensive market review and search was conducted by the VIBA board and ALPA staff for competitive proposals and bids. In addition to competing prices on current services and products, we also searched for a few improvements or enhancements, such as the ability to insure members residing outside the United States while on assignment, and eliminated the underwriting requirements that Guardian had in place, requesting information about private flying, instructor certifications, and other types of flying, such as a license for a helicopter, sometimes even declining members' applications. Based on the evaluation of responses, ALPA found that Metropolitan Life excelled in meeting this criteria and selected them to insure and administer our ALPA-sponsored life and long-term disability beginning November 1st. I realize I've thrown a lot at you today, and I appreciate your attention to our collective fiscal responsibility. Each of us has a duty to the pilots we work for to spend the money wisely. Take a look at this last set of numbers, and I think you'll see the true breadth of what we've accomplished. This shows you the road we've taken, the mountain we've climbed since we first started our long path back to financial solvency in 2012. The year 2011 was part of the floor of the MCF. The OCF was all but broke. We were in the red in terms of operating funds. But from 2012 through today, look at how we've grown. And we have you and all the volunteers to thank for it. Today, our finances are strong. Our collective will and fiscal responsibility has gotten us there. We're able to reduce dues starting in January. We're able to continue to recapitalize the OCF and MCF. We're able to address the issues discussed earlier with the SAFER Committee, and will continue to do so. And if we continue to be responsible stewards of our pilots' money and work together, we're going to continue along the successful path we've taken to do great things. Our strength lies in our unity and in speaking with one voice. And as you've heard Captain DePete say many times, we are all ALPA pilots, not passenger or cargo, mainline or regional, US or Canadian. We are all ALPA pilots. I'm glad to say that even with my new role as the VP of Finance, I've had some opportunities to help pilots in more traditional ways, whether it's helping someone who's stranded and needs an airline ticket, or helping a pilot with a personal issue. Pilots succeed together. With the leadership we have, our volunteers behind us, and strong finances to support us all, we will all succeed. Thank you.